The village of Northmere clung to the mountainside like a scar that refused to heal. Snow fell in sheets that November, thick enough to swallow sound, and Kale watched it from the edges, as she always did. The courtyard fires burned gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the frozen ground, but their warmth never reached her. Around her neck hung a simple iron collar, not a chain, but close enough. It bore no sigil, no pack insignia, no mark of belonging. Every other woman in Northmere wore the moon pendant of their alpha, the symbolic bite mark etched in silver or gold, depending on their rank. Kyle's throat was bare, except for the collar, cold iron against cold skin. Cursed, they whispered, marked by absence. Her mother had been Omega to the old Alpha King. Ragnar, a union that had ended in bloodshed and exile. The rumor was that Kale's father had been outside the pack, a human merchant from the southern kingdoms. That alone was transgression enough. But worse was this. When Kale came of age, the bond never manifested. No alpha could mark her. No male wolf recognized her as their fated mate. Her skin remained unmarked, pale, ordinary, rejected by destiny itself. At 23 winters, Kyle had become a ghost in her own territory. She worked in the kitchens of the Great Hall, preparing food she could not share in the dining ceremonies. She mended clothing for warriors whose names she was forbidden to speak aloud. At night, she slept in a stone chamber beneath the courtyard, where the wind carried the sound of wolves singing their pack bonds under the full moon, a sound that only deepened the ache in her chest. The new Alpha King had arrived 3 moons ago. Soren. Even his name carried weight. Old Norse, meaning stern and grave. The village elders whispered that he had come north from the great fortress of Valdrim, that he carried a wound no healer could close, that his own pack had turned against him over some matter of mercy that they deemed weakness. He was unmarked by choice, they said. No mate, no bond, no softness. Kale had seen him only once, from a distance. Tall beyond measure, broad-shouldered like the mountains themselves, with hair the color of winter ash and eyes that held the gray of storm clouds. When he moved through the courtyard, the other Omegas lowered their eyes in submission. But Kale felt something else, a strange pull, as though his gaze had caught on her invisible thread and tugged. He had looked at her for 1 breath, 2, then turned away. That night, she stood at the edge of the northern cliff, where the wind howled up from the ravine below. The iron collar caught the moonlight, and she pressed her fingers against it, feeling the cold bite into her skin. The full moon hung overhead, luminous and indifferent, and Kale whispered a prayer to the goddess, not for a mark, not for a mate, but simply for the pain to end. "I wish to be seen," she said to the empty sky. Not as cursed, not as broken, just seen. The wind answered with a sound like distant thunder, and somewhere in the fortress behind her, an Alpha King jolted awake from a dream of golden light. Soren had not slept in 6 days. He stood at the window of his chamber, watching the snow fall across the vast expanse of Northmere's territories, and felt the familiar burn of guilt twist through his chest like a living thing. The fortress was warm, fires burned in every hearth. Tapestries hung heavy on stone walls. The great hall filled each night with the sounds of his pack. Yet everything felt hollow. Everything felt like penance. He had been Alpha King of Valdrim for 5 years, ruling with justice and honor, beloved by his pack, until the winter solstice when mercy had cost him everything. A rival from a neighboring territory had been captured after murdering 2 of Soren's warriors. The council had demanded death, immediate and public, a display of power that would warn all challengers. Soren had chosen differently. He had chosen to imprison the wolf, to offer him a path to redemption, to believe that even the darkest could find light. His pack had called it weakness. His beta had called it betrayal. Within a moon cycle, they had stripped him of his status, broken their bonds with him, and cast him north to this dying territory of Northmere, a land so remote, so decimated by old wars that it was barely worth ruling. They had sent him to rot. Sorin had accepted the exile without protest. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps his heart had grown too soft. Perhaps a true Alpha King could not afford mercy. The scar on his left shoulder throbbed, the mark where they had severed the pack bond with ritual fire. It had never fully healed, would never fully heal. It was a wound that lived in both flesh and spirit, a constant reminder that even a king could be abandoned. A knock at the door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. "Enter," he commanded, his voice rough as gravel. His advisor Orm stepped inside, concern creasing his weathered face. Orm was old. He had served Sorin's father, and he was one of the few who had followed Sorin into exile without question. "The kitchens report that supplies run low," Orm said carefully. "The unmarked girl works through the night preparing what she can from the stores, but—" The unmarked. Sorin's head turned sharply. "The one they call cursed. She has no mark, no place in the hierarchy, yet she labors as though she bears the weight of the entire pack. The kitchen master says she has not slept in 3 days. She claims the food must last through the winter." Sorin felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had thought long buried. "What is her name?" Orm hesitated. "They do not call her by name, my king. She is simply the unmarked." Something cold and fierce ignited behind Sorin's gray eyes. He had spent 5 years in a pack that named him by his failures. He would not allow another soul to exist unnamed in his territory. "Bring her to my chamber," he said, "tomorrow at dawn. My king, that would cause—" "I do not care what it causes. Bring her." Orm bowed and withdrew, leaving Sorin alone once more with the weight of his solitude and the strange, sudden ache in his chest that felt almost like recognition. That night, he dreamed of golden light again, a glow that rose from skin unmarked by any pack, a warmth that seemed to call to the frozen places inside him. In the dream, a woman looked at him not with submission, but with understanding, as though she too had been cast out, as though she too knew what it meant to be invisible. When he woke, the scar on his shoulder was burning. Kale was scrubbing blood from the stone courtyard when Orm found her, the blood of a deer that had been slaughtered for the evening feast, her hands raw from the cold water, her breath misting in the frozen air. "The Alpha King summons you," Orm said without preamble. Kyle's hands stilled. The wooden brush dropped into the bucket with a soft splash. "I have done nothing," she whispered. It was not a denial. It was a prayer. Omegas summoned to an Alpha King's chamber were rarely heard from again, their fate determined by whim or rage or the unpredictable hunger of power. "At dawn," Orm continued, his tone neither cruel nor kind. "Wear what you have. The king does not care for ceremony." He left her there, kneeling in the snow, her heart beating like a trapped bird against her ribs. The night stretched before her like an eternity. Kyle returned to her stone chamber and sat on the narrow bed, staring at the iron collar around her neck. She had considered removing it 1,000 times over the years, had imagined the weight lifting away, the freedom of a throat unchained. But the collar had been welded shut when she was born, a symbol that she would never be marked by any alpha, and therefore could never truly leave. She braided her dark hair with numb fingers. Her skin was pale from years spent indoors, her body lean from rationed meals, her eyes the color of storm gray. She wore the simple gray dress of an unmarked Omega, rough linen that scratched against her skin. When the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, she climbed the stairs to the fortress proper. The Alpha King's chamber was vast, high ceilings, a massive fireplace where flames danced in shades of crimson and gold, windows that overlooked the entire northern territory. And Sorin stood before the fire, silhouetted against the light, his gray eyes tracking her entrance with an intensity that made her want to run. "Leave us," he commanded, and Orm withdrew, closing the heavy door behind him. Kale stood at the threshold, hands trembling. She did not bow. The unmarked were not required to bow, but she kept her eyes lowered. "What is your name?" Soren asked. His voice was softer than she expected. Rough, yes, but not harsh. "I am not called by name," Kyle replied quietly. "I know what they call you. I asked for your name." Kale looked up then, and their eyes met. Storm gray. Meeting. Storm gray. As though they were two pieces of the same sky, fractured and falling separately. "Kyle," she said, "my mother named me Kale after an old word meaning to endure." Something flickered across Soren's face, recognition, perhaps, or kinship. He moved closer, and Kale's instinct screamed at her to retreat, but her feet remained rooted to the stone floor. "The collar," he said, reaching toward her throat. "Does it pain you?" "Always," Kyle answered, because there seemed no point in lying. Soren's fingers brushed the cold iron, and Kyle felt the shock of his touch travel down her spine like lightning. He was warm, impossibly warm, radiating heat like a forge. "I was sent north to rule a broken territory," Soren said quietly. "A punishment dressed as a throne. My own pack deemed me too soft, too merciful to lead." He withdrew his hand, and Kyle felt the absence like a wound. "I know something of being deemed unfit, of being unmarked by those who should have valued you." Kyle's breath caught. "You chose to remain unmarked?" "I chose," Soren said simply. "I refused their bonds after they refused my mercy. Better to rule alone than to rule in chains." He moved to the fireplace and gestured for her to sit. Kyle hesitated, then moved to the chair he indicated, perching on its edge like a bird ready to flee. "I want you to work in the fortress proper," Soren continued, "not in the kitchens. I want you to tend the library, to organize my records, to have a chamber with a real bed and a window. I want you to take meals with the household staff, not alone in darkness." Kale stared at him. "Why?" "Because I see you," Soren said, and his voice held a weight that made her bones ache. "Everyone in this territory looks through you, past you, around you. I see you, Kale. I see someone who has endured when every force in the world told her to break. That is not cursed. That is strength." Something broke inside Kale's chest, a dam that had held back tears for 23 years. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let them fall. "If I work closer to you," she said carefully, "they will speak of it. They will say I have bewitched you, that the unmarked girl has corrupted the Alpha King." Soren smiled then, a sharp, cold smile that held no warmth. "Let them speak. I am already damned in their eyes. At least I will be damned for choosing something true." He extended his hand to her, and Kyle saw the scar on his shoulder, a terrible wound, pale against his bronze skin, the mark of a severed bond. "Come," he said. "Let me show you that there are other ways to belong." Kyle took his hand, and the moment her skin touched his, every cell in her body sang with a recognition that had no name. The iron collar around her neck grew warm, not uncomfortably so, but as though it were remembering what it meant to hold something precious. She did not understand what was happening. But as she rose and followed Soren deeper into the fortress, she allowed herself a single, dangerous thought. Perhaps the goddess had heard her prayer after all. Perhaps being unseen had not been a curse. Perhaps it had been a preparation. Perhaps she had been waiting for someone equally broken to find her in the dark. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. 3 moons passed, and the fortress began to shift like a creature waking from hibernation. Kale's chamber was on the eastern tower, where morning light flooded through tall windows and touched the worn books she had begun to organize. The library had been chaos when Soren first granted her access, centuries of records scattered across stone shelves, scrolls crumbling to dust, histories written in languages half forgotten by the living world. She had made it her sanctuary. Each morning, she rose before dawn and worked through the collection, preserving what could be saved, transcribing what was too fragile to touch. The work was meditative, grounding, a way to quiet the constant hum of awareness that had begun the moment Soren took her hand. Because something was changing. Something in her skin, in her blood, in the deep places where the soul lived. It had started small. A warmth that spread through her body when Soren entered the room, as though her very atoms recognized him. A pull in her chest when he walked past her in the corridors, a sensation between ache and yearning that had no name in any language she knew. But yesterday, something else had happened. She had been in the library, reading an ancient text written in the old tongue, words about the Pathfinders, rare Omegas who bore a gift that appeared only when they encountered their true alpha. According to the scrolls, a Pathfinder could see through illusion, could sense the deepest truths of a soul, could heal wounds that no blade had made. And as she read, the iron collar around her neck had begun to glow. Not with heat, with light. A soft, golden luminescence that spread across the metal like liquid gold finding its shape. The glow had lasted only moments before fading, but Kyle's hands had shaken as she set down the scroll. That night, she could not sleep. She had dressed and made her way through the darkened fortress, drawn by a pull she could not name, until she found herself standing outside Soren's chamber. The door opened before she could knock. "You feel it too," he said. It was not a question. Soren wore no shirt, and Kyle could see the terrible scar that crossed his left shoulder, the severed bond that had haunted him for 5 years. But something was different about it. The scar was lighter than it had been, as though something was healing it from within. "The collar," Kyle said. "It glowed. Why?" Soren reached for her neck, and Kyle held still as he traced the iron with his thumb. "Because you are beginning to accept what you are. And what you are calls to what I am." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "You have heard the old stories of Pathfinders?" Kyle nodded. "I believed them to be myth," Soren continued, "until I read the same scroll yesterday. The goddess does not mark Pathfinders with a pack sigil, because they do not belong to one pack. They belong to destiny itself. They are rare, Kyle. Perhaps 1 in 1,000 generations." He paused. "They are born to heal the wounds that cannot be healed by any other means." "What wound?" Kale whispered. "The wound of being forsaken by those you loved. The wound of being told you are unfit to lead, unfit to love, unfit to exist as you are." Soren's voice was hoarse. "That wound lives in both of us, Kale, and I think your presence is beginning to mend it." He released her, and Kale felt the distance like a physical pain. "If this is true," she said carefully, "the pack will rebel. They already fear me. If they believe I have a gift, they will try to use you," Soren interrupted, his voice hard as stone, "or destroy you to prevent anyone else from having you. I know." He turned away, his jaw clenched. "That is why you must choose now, while the choice still exists. Leave Northmere. I will give you passage, supplies, freedom. You can live beyond the reach of any pack." "And what of your wound?" Kyle asked. Soren did not turn back to face her. "I have lived with it for 5 years. I will live with it for 50 more, if it means your safety." Kyle stepped forward, and before fear could stop her, she reached out and placed her hand on the scar. The moment her skin touched him, the entire chamber filled with golden light. Soren gasped, his body going rigid, and Kyle felt it, a sensation like touching the sun itself, like her very essence was pouring out of her skin and into him. She saw flashes of his memories, a younger Soren, laughing with warriors he had loved. The moment the severing happened, fire burning through the bond while his pack turned their faces away. 5 years of solitude, of wondering if they had been right, if he truly was too broken to lead. And beneath it all, a deeper wound. The fear that he would never be worthy of love, that mercy would forever mark him as weak, that he was destined to be alone. The light intensified, and Kyle heard him cry out, not in pain, but in something that sounded almost like prayer. Then it faded. The chamber fell dark except for the firelight, and Kale collapsed against Soren's chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Soren caught her, his arms wrapping around her protectively. When he released her enough to look at her face, his eyes were wide with awe. "The scar," Kale whispered. "It's healing." And it was. The terrible pale line that had marked him for so long was fading, growing fainter, the edges softening as though it had been touched by something far older and more powerful than time. "Kyle," Soren said, and his voice trembled with something that might have been fear or wonder or both. "I do not yet know what this is, but I know that you are no longer cursed. You are the answer to a prayer I did not know how to speak." Kyle pulled back, studying his face. "The Alpha King of Valdrim was wrong. The Council was wrong. They looked at you and saw weakness because you chose mercy over power. But that is not weakness, Soren. That is the truest strength." She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "And I am not cursed. I am a pathfinder. I am the one who was born to find the path back to yourself." Soren lowered his forehead to hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as a servant, not as a tool or a treasure. Stay as someone I choose and who chooses me. Stay and let us heal each other." Kyle did not answer in words. Instead, she reached for the collar around her neck, and as her fingers touched the iron, it glowed once more, not with the golden light of healing, but with a different radiance, one that spoke of bonds and choices and destinies intertwined. "I will stay," she said finally, "for as long as you will have me." And in the darkness of the northern fortress, 2 broken souls began to mend. The whispers began in the courtyard and spread like poison through the fortress. The unmarked girl had been seen in the Alpha King's chamber, not once, but repeatedly. She had been given a room with windows. She had taken meals at the household table. The collar around her neck had begun to glow. They called it bewitchment, corruption. They said the cursed had finally shown her true nature, that she had somehow ensnared the Alpha King with dark magic learned from the pagan places beyond the territories. Kyle heard the whispers, but did not speak against them. She continued her work in the library, organizing the records, transcribing the old texts. And every night, she and Soren met in the hidden chamber beneath the fortress, a place of stone and ancient magic where they could speak freely, away from eyes and judgment. It was there that Soren told her the truth about his past. "I was not sent north as a punishment," he confessed one night, as they sat by a fire that burned without wood, fed only by the lingering magic of the place. It was an execution disguised as exile. My beta had already chosen my replacement. The council was waiting for me to fail so they could declare me unfit and put another in my place. "But you have not failed," Kyle said softly. "Haven't I?" Soren's voice was bitter. "I allowed myself to care for someone I should have kept at a distance. I allowed my heart to lead instead of my duty. Every day. I wonder if this is how it begins, the slow corruption of a leader's judgment." Kyle moved closer to him, taking his hand. "You are not corrupted. You are awakening. There is a difference." Soren looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I love you," he said simply. I know it is too soon. I know it is reckless and dangerous and every kind of foolish. But I love you, Kale. I love you as I have never loved anyone or anything in this world. Kale's heart shattered and reformed all at once. I love you too, she whispered, not because you are an alpha king or because you chose to see me. I love you because you are broken in the same places I am broken, because you understand what it means to be deemed unworthy, because when you look at me, I feel real. Soren reached for her then, and Kale felt the moment change around them. It was not the healing touch of the Pathfinder. It was something fiercer, more intimate, the touch of a man choosing a woman, not for destiny or blood, but for the simple, revolutionary act of love. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then Soren's arms tightened around her, and Kale felt the hunger beneath his restraint, the 5 years of loneliness, the belief that he would never again be able to trust another soul, the desperate need to be known and accepted as he was. She answered with her own hunger, her own need, her own belief that in him she had found the mirror of her own shattered self. When they separated, Kale rested her forehead against his, and the iron collar around her neck glowed so brightly it cast shadows on the stone walls. There is something we must face, Soren said finally. The pack grows restless. They sense something is changing, and they fear it. Orm brought me reports today. There are whispers of a delegation coming from Valdrim. They sent word that they wish to confirm whether I am still fit to rule. What they mean is that they intend to remove me. Kyle pulled back, studying his face. Then we leave, together. You take your followers, and we go beyond their reach. I will not run, Soren said, and his voice carried the weight of command. I have run from enough. I will not run from this choice, and I will not ask you to run either. He touched her face gently. But I will not put you in danger, Kyle. If it comes to a choice between my throne and your life, you will choose neither, Kyle interrupted. Because I am stronger than you think. The Pathfinder gift is not just for healing wounds, Soren. It is for revealing truth, and the truth of this situation is something we have not yet seen. What do you mean? I do not yet know, Kyle admitted, but I know that the scrolls speak of more than healing. They speak of pathfinders who could see into the hearts of entire packs, who could sense treachery and illuminate lies. I think I need to read more. That night, Kale returned to the library and read until her eyes burned with exhaustion. And finally, in a scroll so ancient that its parchment crumbled at her touch, she found it. The story of a pathfinder named Solace who had faced a council determined to remove her alpha. Solace had not fought them with weapons. Instead, she had gathered the entire pack in the great hall and invited them to place their hands upon hers. And when they did, she had shown them the truth, not with words, but with visions pulled directly from the deep places of the soul. She had shown them what they truly valued, what they truly feared, what they truly wanted. And in that revelation, the council's conspiracy had crumbled, because the people of the pack understood that the lies they had been told served only the powerful, not themselves. Kale set down the scroll and made a decision. When the delegation from Valdrim arrived 3 days later, Kale was ready. The great hall filled with wolves in human form, warriors from Valdrim, their silver packmarks gleaming on their shoulders, their faces set in expressions of authority and cold judgment. At the head sat Karen, Soren's former beta, a man whose beauty was marred only by the cruelty that lived behind his eyes. Behind him stood Lisa, the council representative, her mouth twisted in a smile that held no warmth. Soren, Karen began, his voice like honey over poison. We have come to assess your fitness to rule. It has been 5 moons since your exile. We wish to see if you have restored yourself to our standards. Kyle stood at the rear of the hall, dressed not in the simple gray of an unmarked omega, but in a gown of deep blue that Soren had commissioned, a gown that fit her like a second skin and bore no insignia, no mark of any pack. Her dark hair was braided with silver thread, and her throat was bare of the iron collar. She had asked Soren to remove it that morning. It had taken effort. The collar had been welded since her birth, but Soren's strength and Kyle's will had finally broken it open. When it fell away, the skin beneath was pale and unmarked, free for the first time in her life. "I am fit," Soren replied calmly. "The territory prospers. The people are fed and safe. My rule is just and merciful." "Merciful," Lisa repeated mockingly. "We have heard troubling reports. We are told that you have taken an unmarked omega into your personal favor, that you spend your nights with a creature of uncertain origins, that you have allowed sentimentality to cloud your judgment." Cal stepped forward then, and every eye in the hall turned to her. She could feel the shock, the way they processed her unmarked throat, her fine clothes, her bearing that spoke of something other than servitude. "I am Kale," she said, and her voice carried the strange, resonant quality of the Pathfinder, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I am no one's property and no one's tool. I am the Pathfinder, and I am here to show you the truth of this man's leadership." She extended her hand toward the delegation, and something in her eyes made even Karen hesitate. "Place your hands in mine," Kale commanded. "All of you. Or are you afraid of what you might see?" Karen laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "I will not." But Lisa rose, and her face held a strange expression, hunger masked as duty. She approached Kale and took her hand. The moment their skin touched, the great hall filled with golden light. Kale opened herself to the Pathfinder gift fully for the first time, and it was like stepping into a storm made of light and truth. She pulled from Lisa's mind the memories of the council meetings where they had conspired to destroy Soren, not because he was unfit, but because they feared him. They had feared his mercy because it threatened their power structure. They had feared his strength because it did not rely on cruelty. They had feared that other territories might see in him a different way to lead, a way that valued the welfare of the people over the expansion of power. And beneath Lisa's official doubts, Kale found a deeper wound, a daughter that Lisa had lost to a merciless Alpha King 10 years ago, a death that Lisa had never avenged because she lacked the strength. She had driven her cruelty forward in compensation, had climbed the ranks of the council by proving how merciless she could be. Kale did not judge. She simply showed Lisa the truth of herself, reflected back with perfect clarity. Lisa collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face, and Kale released her hand. One by one, the others approached. Some came willingly. Others came because they were driven by pride or curiosity or the desperate need to prove they had nothing to hide. And with each touch, Kale illuminated the deepest truths of their souls. She showed them the warriors who followed Kieran out of genuine loyalty, and the ones who followed him only from fear of reprisal. She showed them the ways that Soren's mercy had actually strengthened the territory, how the imprisoned murderer had become a builder, had designed the mechanisms that allowed Northmere's surviving population to survive through the harshest winters. She showed them that Soren's wisdom lay not in his willingness to shed blood, but in his refusal to shed it unnecessarily. And finally, she turned to Karen. "No," Karen said, backing away. "I will not be subjected to your witchcraft." "It is not witchcraft," Kyle replied calmly. "It is truth. And you are more afraid of the truth than you are of any blade." She extended her hand, and Karen could not help himself. The pull of a Pathfinder was irresistible to those who carried dark secrets. He took her hand, and in that moment, every member of the delegation saw what Kale saw. Karen had poisoned the former Alpha King, Soren's father. It was a slow poison, administered in wine over months, designed to make the death appear natural. Karen had done it because the old Alpha had refused to expand into territories Karen believed were theirs by right. Karen had done it because he was consumed by ambition that no amount of power could satisfy. And he had hoped that by turning the council against Soren, he could place himself on the throne. As the truth blazed through the hall like wildfire, Karen screamed and tried to run. But the warriors around him, the ones who had been loyal to him out of fear, rose up and blocked his path. Kyle felt Soren come to her side, felt his hand slide into hers. Together they stood and watched as justice took its course without their hand ever being raised in violence. When it was done, when Karen had been taken into custody and the delegation had collapsed into shocked silence, Lysa approached Kyle and bowed deeply. "You have shown us what we were too afraid to see," Lysa said. "Soren is not only fit to rule, he is the kind of leader we need, one who understands that strength without mercy is merely tyranny." The other council members agreed, one by one. They pledged their loyalty not just to Soren, but to a new way of ruling, one that Soren would establish with Kale's gift to guide him. But as the delegation prepared to leave, as the fortress bustled with the aftermath of revelation, Kale felt something strange shift in her body. The gift had taken a price. She could feel it in the way her limbs trembled, in the way the world seemed to spin slightly around her. Soren caught her as she began to fall, and he swept her into his arms and carried her to their hidden chamber. "What is happening?" she whispered as he laid her gently on their bed of furs. "You have used too much of your gift," Soren said, his voice rough with fear. "The scrolls warn of this. A pathfinder must be careful not to empty themselves entirely, or they will become hollow. They will become untethered from the world." Kyle's vision was beginning to blur. She could feel herself drifting, as though her spirit was being drawn upward, away from her body. "Soren," she whispered, "do not let me go." And Soren did what he could do, the only thing a broken Alpha King could do for a pathfinder who had given too much. He lay beside her and opened his bond, the bond that he had kept sealed for 5 years, and he anchored her to himself. He gave her a tether back to the world, and he held her through the night as she drifted between the waking and the dreaming, between life and the strange borderlands where the pathfinders walked. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. 3 days, and Kyle did not wake. She lay motionless in their hidden chamber, her breathing shallow, her skin cold even beneath the furs and blankets Soren piled upon her. The golden glow that had surrounded her for the past moons had faded to almost nothing, leaving her looking diminished, fragile, like a candle that had burned away its own wax. Soren did not leave her side. He sat by her bed and whispered the old prayers to the goddess, prayers his mother had taught him as a child. He held Kale's hand and told her stories of the future they would build together, stories that he knew she could not hear, but that he needed to speak into the darkness anyway, as though words alone might hold her to the world. Orm brought food that Soren did not eat. The pack brought supplies and information about the aftermath of the revelation, how Lysa was slowly dismantling the old council structure, how the territory was beginning to reorganize around principles of justice rather than domination. None of it mattered to Soren. The throne meant nothing if Kale was lost. On the night of the 3rd day, when even his hope had begun to fray, Soren did something he had not done since his pack had cast him out. He opened himself fully to the sacred magic of the old places, the magic that lived in blood and bone and the deep connection between an alpha and his destined other. He cut his palm and let blood drip onto Kyle's lips. It was not a claiming. The claiming came only with consent. It was an offering, a prayer. A desperate act born of love that had no other recourse. "Come back," he whispered. "Please, Kale, come back to me." And incredibly, impossibly, Kale drew a breath that was not the shallow breathing of the almost dead, but a real breath, deep and full of intention. Her eyes flickered open, storm gray and luminous, as though she had looked into the face of the goddess herself and been forever changed by what she saw. "I saw," Kyle whispered, her voice hoarse. "I saw the true nature of the bonds we build. The way that Alpha and Omega are not meant to be dominion and submission, but rather two halves of a single strength." She turned her head and looked at Soren with eyes that held depths he had never seen before. "I saw us, Soren. I saw what we could become if we dared to bind ourselves not as king and subject, but as equals." Soren felt his heart stumble in his chest. "What are you asking?" "I am asking you to bind with me," Kale said softly. "Not as your servant or your tool or even as your mate in the traditional sense. I am asking you to bind as two souls who choose each other, knowing the full truth of what that means. I am asking you to let me help you carry the weight of this territory and this crown." Soren took her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes to all of it. Yes to you." They could not perform the ritual properly. Kale was too weak to stand, and Soren refused to leave her side to gather witnesses. But they did what they could. Soren took a length of silver thread and tied it around both their wrists, binding them together. Then he leaned down and marked her, not with teeth or fire, but with the gentle pressure of his lips against her unmarked shoulder. Where his lips touched her skin, a mark appeared. Not the pack insignia of any existing territory, but something entirely new. A symbol that was half wolf, half something else entirely, something that spoke of the Pathfinder's gift, of the bond between guide and guided, of two broken things becoming whole through choice rather than destiny. And Kale marked him in turn, pressing her forehead to his in the ancient gesture of equality, and the air around them shimmered with golden light, a light that seemed to come from beyond the world, from the place where the goddess watched over her beloved. When dawn broke, Kale was strong enough to sit up. By midday, she was able to walk, Soren supporting her as they climbed the stairs back to the fortress proper. The pack saw them emerge together, bound by silver thread, bearing marks that no one in living memory had seen. And they understood, even without words, that something fundamental had changed. The old hierarchy of dominance and submission was being replaced by something the people of Northmere had never dared to imagine, a rule built on partnership, on two beings choosing each other daily, on the revolutionary idea that strength could mean yielding to someone you trusted with your soul. That night, Soren stood in the Great Hall and announced a new order for Northmere. Not an Alpha King ruling over servants, but a territory guided by both an Alpha and his Pathfinder. Every decision would be made together. Every law would be examined for both justice and mercy. Some of the old guard protested. Some left the territory, unable to accept this new way. But many stayed. Many stepped forward to rebuild, to create something that had never existed before in the blood-stained history of the werewolf territories. A place where the broken could be remade, where the cursed could become blessed, where love was not a weakness, but the truest strength of all. Winter turned to spring, and Northmere bloomed. The snow melted, revealing the green beneath, and with the coming of green came the coming of new life. Flowers grew in the courtyard that had known only ice and blood for decades. The people began to build new structures, not fortifications designed to keep the world out, but homes designed to welcome it in. Kale stood in the tower window of their chamber and watched it all unfold. Her skin still bore the mark that Soren had placed there, the symbol of the Pathfinder Alpha bond, and she traced it often with her fingers, marveling at the way it seemed to glow softly whenever Soren was near. The gift had changed since her near death. It was no longer the violent, searing power that had lit the great hall with truth. Instead, it had become something gentler, more nuanced, a gift of understanding rather than exposure. When Kale touched someone now, she could sense their deepest needs rather than their darkest secrets. She could guide them toward healing rather than judgment. Soren believed it was because the gift had learned compassion through her own suffering. They had established a small council of advisors, not the old ruthless council from Valdrim, but a new one made up of people from all classes of Northmere society. Lisa sat at the table, along with farmers and artisans, and yes, even some warriors. Every voice was heard. Every decision was made collectively. It should have been chaos. Instead, it was harmony. A knock at the door pulled Kyle from her reverie. "Enter," she called, though she already knew who it would be. She could always sense Soren before he arrived. He entered carrying a leather-bound journal, and his expression was serious in a way that made Kale's heart quicken. "I have been reading the old scrolls," he said without preamble, "the ones about the Pathfinders and how their gifts sometimes manifest across generations." Kale felt her breath catch. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that in a few moons we will have a child," Soren said quietly. "And that child might carry this gift forward, might inherit the ability to heal and guide and illuminate truth." He paused. "I wanted to ask you, before we continue, if you are willing to bring a child into a world that has feared both of us. If you are willing to raise someone who might be even more powerful than you are, and even more hated for it." Kyle turned from the window and approached him. She took the journal from his hands and set it aside, then took his face between her palms. "I was cursed for my entire life," she said softly. "I was told I would never be worthy, never be marked, never be loved. And now I stand here, bound to an Alpha King, helping to reshape an entire territory, preparing to bring new life into the world." She smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Yes, Soren. Yes to all of it. Whatever comes, we will face it together." Soren pulled her close, and they stood at the window as the sun set over Northmere, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the colors of redemption, the colors of fire that had learned to warm rather than burn. Somewhere in the fortress, bells began to ring, a simple, joyful sound that echoed across the territory. It was tradition for the people to ring the bells when the Alpha and Pathfinder appeared together, a recognition that the balance between mercy and power had been maintained for another day. But this time, the bells rang with an extra note, a new tone that Soren and Kyle had not heard before. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the deep places where the goddess dwelt, a sound that spoke of approval and blessing. As night fell, Kale felt the child moving within her, a flutter like wings, like the first stirrings of something new being born into existence. She placed her hand over Soren's heart, feeling it beat beneath her palm, and she understood something that had taken her entire life to learn. The curse had never been real. It had always been a path. The unmarked collar had always been a gateway. The rejection had always been redirection. Everything that had seemed like an ending had merely been a beginning, wearing a different face. She was no longer the cursed girl from the kitchens. She was Kale, Pathfinder, partner to an Alpha King, guide to a territory being reborn. She was a woman who had been shattered and had chosen to be remade in her own image, not the image others had demanded. And as she looked out over Northmere, a land transformed from frozen desolation into something alive and hopeful, she whispered a final prayer to the goddess, not for herself or for Soren, but for the child who would carry this legacy forward. May they be strong enough to be gentle. May they be wise enough to rule with mercy. May they understand that the greatest power of all is the power to choose love again and again in a world that will always offer cruelty as an alternative. The bells rang on into the night, and Northmere dreamed of spring. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive. Epilogue. The mark returns. 7 years later, a visitor arrived at the gates of Northmere. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with gray eyes that held the weight of authority, and she bore the silver insignia of the Council of Valdrim on her sleeve. Her name was Kestra, and she had traveled north for a single reason, to see for herself if the rumors were true. They said that Soren had gone soft, that Northmere had become a territory run by democracy rather than might, that the Alpha King had bound himself to an Omega, had made her an equal in power and decision-making. They said it was an abomination that could not be allowed to stand. Soren and Kale received her in the great hall, and Kestra's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. There was no throne elevated above others. There were no servants bowing. Instead, there were people of all ranks sitting together, discussing the future harvest, debating water rights, laughing occasionally at something someone had said. And standing slightly to the left of the central table was a child, a girl of perhaps 6 years, with her mother's dark hair and her father's storm-gray eyes. On her shoulder, barely visible beneath her tunic, was a mark, the symbol of the Pathfinder. "Explain," Kestra commanded, her voice sharp as broken glass. "There is nothing to explain," Kale said calmly. She rose from her seat and extended her hand to the child, who came immediately to her side. "This is Ilara, our daughter. This is our future. This is what happens when you allow people to choose rather than command them to obey." Kestra's hand moved to her weapon. "The Council will not allow this to continue. They will send armies." "No, they will not," Soren interrupted quietly. He stood, and the entire assembly rose with him, not out of submission, but out of unity. Because within the territory of Valdrim, 3 other alphas have already begun to implement similar changes. Your counselors are losing their authority, Kestra, and they are terrified. Kestra's face went pale. She looked around the room at the dozens of faces turned toward her, not hostile, but steady, not threatening, but immovable. She understood then that she had lost before she had even begun. The age of rule through fear and domination was ending. The age of partnership and choice was beginning. Kestra turned to leave, and as she reached the door, Ilara called out to her. "Wait," the child said, and her voice carried the strange, resonant quality of the Pathfinder. "You came here expecting to destroy us, but you are afraid. You are afraid that your own power will be taken from you, and you do not know who you will be without it." Kestra froze. "I can show you," Ilara continued. "I can show you who you could become if you allowed yourself to change, if you allowed yourself to believe that there is something beyond domination." For a moment, just a moment, Kestra hesitated, and in that hesitation there was the smallest flickering of hope. But fear won out. She turned and left without another word, riding back toward Valdrim to deliver news that would shake the foundations of the Council. As the gates closed behind her, Ilara returned to her seat beside her parents. "Do you think she will tell them?" the child asked. "Yes," Soren said. He placed one hand on his daughter's shoulder and his other hand on Kyle's. "And some will listen. Some will resist. Some will be afraid. But some," Kyle said softly, "will understand that the world is ready for something new." That night, as Northmere settled into sleep, Ilara asked her parents to tell her the story again, the story of how they met, how they were both cursed, and then how they chose each other anyway. And as Soren and Kale spoke, their voices weaving together like the threads that had bound their wrists 7 years before, the child understood something that took most beings a lifetime to learn. The greatest power is not the power to command or dominate. It is the power to see another soul clearly, completely, without judgment, and to choose to love that soul anyway, despite all its cracks and wounds and broken places. That power would reshape the world. And it had been born not in a fortress of ice and blood, but in the simple revolutionary act of an unmarked girl and a broken king choosing each other in the dark. The moon rose over Northmere, silver and full and impossibly bright, and somewhere in the distance wolves sang, not in hunger or territory marking or dominance, but in joy, in freedom, in the simple celebration of a night that felt kinder than the one before it. The age of the Pathfinder had begun, and it would change everything.